tremendous potential to severely, repeatedly, you can have PTSD from a car accident, from an incident in a war, from gun violence on a street, from all kinds of things. But complex trauma comes when somebody is repeatedly, chronically exposed to traumatic events over years. It usually involves harm from those people in their lives who should have been caregivers. So the ones who were to care for are the ones actually doing the traumatizing. It often occurs at developmentally vulnerable times, and we'll talk more about that. And so it has a tremendous potential to severely compromise human development. So what that means is that you can have a client or patient come in to see you, or you can have somebody in your church or whatever ministry you have who appears to be one way, but is actually profoundly compromised internally because of this kind of chronic, over the lifespan traumatizing. So one of the things we found out is that in complex and traumatic stressors, they are generally interpersonal. You can get traumatized by a tsunami, but when you have been traumatized by your own father, it's a whole different thing. They are premeditated. They are always caused by other human beings. They involve profound relational betrayal, because it's usually some kind of caregiver, and profound deception. So it's usually repeated and chronic, and so what we have is an individual, particularly, let's think about a child, being marinated in trauma from birth. So this is a child who is developing, who is supposed to be growing and learning and blossoming, who is instead buried in this stuff called trauma at every stage. It can be physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and chronic neglect in the child's life. Complex trauma also has another category, and that is that it describes people who have layers of trauma. So on the one hand, you may have this child who's growing up in this very traumatic environment across the lifespan. That's complex trauma. The other possibility would be, suppose you're working with a veteran of a war, and he's got trauma, and you think he has PTSD, but then as you get to know him more, you realize that doesn't cover it. That's often somebody who, for example, grew up under a violent father in an alcoholic home, lived in an inner city where there was a lot of gun violence on the street, enlisted, went to war, and saw combat and was traumatized there as well. So you have the cumulative effect of all these different traumas that occurred in different places, but it's also complex trauma. So those are the two possible subsets of that. So let's think about some of the factors involved in a situation that produces complex trauma. First of all, thinking again of a child, it results in insecure and disorganized attachments. How do you bond with parents who damage you chronically? They are exploited wherever they are vulnerable, and children are, of course, always vulnerable. They are used. Victims of this kind of trauma live in constant distress, and that has profound physiological impact on the brain, on the adrenal gland, all kinds of things that can often be things that last lifelong. They are not only under constant distress, but there's no exit door. If you're 5 years old, you can't get away. So they have gross insecurity, instability, and ongoing pain and suffering. And in such an environment, the individual never gets to regain emotional equilibrium. You think about perhaps a car accident, maybe, that some of you have been in or witnessed, and how everything's thrown out of kilter. And it takes a while, particularly if you were driving, for you to even think about getting behind the wheel again and all of those things. But eventually you get some sort of emotional equilibrium, and little by little can claim that area of your life back. But when you live with chronic trauma, there's no place to do that. There's no equilibrium to gain. So for many, trauma is not a terrifying event, which is how PTSD has been described. It is rather a terrifying life. So as a result of chronic and interpersonal trauma, this individual will be extremely vigilant, very watchful for danger all the time, constantly expecting it, live with chronic anxiety and terror. All of their psychological energy is bent by necessity toward coping, which means things like hiding, self-protecting, rather than having that psychological energy bent toward learning and growing, which is where a healthy child in a healthy environment gets to go. They get to imagine, they get to experiment, they get to test, they get to learn. They don't have to keep coping with this trauma over here all the time. The victim has been betrayed and is often either separated from those who are caregivers and nurturers, or they are stuck with those who are not. There is no safe person in their life. They don't know what that means. So let me give you a few broad categories of the impact of this ongoing interpersonal trauma in the life of a developing child. You think about child development, and I'm assuming many of you have or have had children. Children are malleable, like clay. That means they are capable of being shaped. So they're developing a sense of person. You know, when you have an infant, you don't know who the infant's going to turn out to be. Well, neither does the infant. The infant has not discovered himself yet. So the child, as they grow, is supposed to be answering the question, who am I? What can I do? What can't I do? What am I good at? Do I matter? Do I have impact? If I cry, does somebody come? Am I lovable? Just as children develop knowledge and skills, like how to walk and talk and eat or do math, so they develop a sense of self, a personhood, as we might say, an awareness and sense, a definition and assessment of myself. The impact of chronic interpersonal violence on that process is staggering. Secondly, complex trauma involves betrayal at its core. You think about this. The person is being hurt by someone they should be able to trust. Parent, grandparent, siblings, uncles and aunts, coach, pastor, teacher. Those are all the people that along the way of the child's growing who should be caretaking, protecting, teaching, nurturing. Those who should help not only fail to help, but repeatedly morally damage the child and erode their sense of self. So the self is marinated in abandonment, deception, blame, humiliation, and isolation. And you know when you marinate something, you do it so the flavor gets all the way in. So when you're a child being marinated in these things, it gets all the way in. Third, as a result, the child victim develops a deep and abiding sense of shame. Anybody who's been around children for just a small amount of time knows that children think egocentrically. They believe they are the center of the universe. Most of us grow out of that. But what happens is, because they think that way, they think when something bad happens, it's their fault. So you might, if you're working with a child whose parents are going through a difficult divorce or something, you know, a little boy might say, you know, if I were a good little boy, Mommy and Daddy wouldn't be getting a divorce. Well, that's an outright lie. But the child can't see beyond himself for many years. That's just the way humans develop. And then often, of course, those bad things that they assume responsibility for, that responsibility is reinforced with blaming words, shaming words, by the supposed caretakers. So, for example, an uncle might say to a little girl, you know, I wouldn't sexually abuse you if you weren't so seductive. So she already thinks she's the center of the universe, and now he's proven to her that she is, and who she is bad. Children who grow up in complex trauma do not see themselves as doing bad things. They see themselves as the essence of bad. So they believe that the self is disordered. So this category has been developed in recent years because the research has shown that those people who are typically diagnosed with PTSD, out of that, many of them were found by clinicians to be 8 times more likely to have additional disorders than people who did not have PTSD. So we used to see people with PTSD and then say, well, they also have major depression, and they also have maybe a dissociative disorder, and they have an eating disorder, and they have an addiction. Well, you know, you've got a page full of diagnoses. So somebody had a light go on in their brain and said, wait a minute, maybe these aren't all different diagnoses. Maybe they all are subsets of one. And that's how complex trauma developed. So they started talking about that. There's a history of that. But I think what we need to know as people who interact with people in a very traumatizing world, that we need an understanding of complex trauma, because if we're going to help people who've been marinated in this stuff, we want to consider really who they are and understand how they see us and hear us. Because oftentimes we'll see the damage and we'll want to help, but if we don't understand who we're helping, we will actually not help and sometimes do damage. So there are parts of the person that are altered when they are marinated in trauma, and I want to go through some of those, the things that change as the child develops. So when you get to be an adult, these things are different than they would have been in a healthy environment. The first has to do with regulating your emotions and your impulses. That's profoundly impacted when you're marinated like this. People who have been in prolonged trauma tend to overreact to stress. They become easily overwhelmed. They exhibit intense anger or rage. They have very great difficulty calming themselves down. They do not know how to self-soothe. They are often self-destructive. Eating disorders, addictions, self-injury, cutting, things like that. They don't know how to modulate anger and other feelings. They don't know how to manage impulses, like an impulse for suicide, or sexual acting out, or risk-taking behavior. Sometimes they will modulate their feelings by doing things we think are bad for them, and we would be right. But for example, addictions and self-harm make people feel numb. To somebody who has all of these symptoms, that's a good place to live. So they have to do something destructive in order to have any sense of quiet or peace. Second, we also see alterations or changes in the way the person is able to be attentive or conscious about things. Chronic trauma is, by definition, inescapable. It's very distressing. It overwhelms all the normal coping mechanisms that humans use. You know, if somebody's hurting you, you get away if you can. Or you fight back if you can. Or you tell them to stop. Or you get help. None of those things work when a child is being chronically traumatized. And so when there's no way to get away from that which is terrifying and overwhelming, the only way to get away is in here. And so children who live like this often use dissociation, which is simply a way of taking the mind away from the present and putting it someplace inside that actually isn't out here in the physical world. So you might talk to people. It has a similar effect to addictions because it helps them get removed from the trauma. So you might talk to somebody who will say something to you like, you know, when I was a little girl, I used to feel like I was able to hide up in the corner of the ceiling under the paper on the wallflower. And what you come to find out is that that's where she took herself in her mind while she was being sexually abused. So what happens is that capacity to leave the present and go be someplace else in your mind gets habituated over time. And one of the things that that does is make people who are terrified all the time they're going to get hurt not able to protect themselves. One of the things the research has showed is that, for example, women with long histories of sexual abuse who have complex trauma are more frequently raped than the general population of women. And the reason for that is that if you are an incest survivor and you're walking down a dark alley in your city and you hear footsteps, your mind will leave. So you can't take care of yourself and pay attention to what's going on. Is it safe? Is it not safe? Do I need to run? You quit processing what's happening in the front of your mind, and you retreat to your hiding place in your mind. So you're unaware, you block out what you're hearing, and you're obviously much more likely then to get hurt. So there are several studies that have shown that if somebody does that when they're being traumatized, it is the most significant long-term predictor for the development of a trauma disorder. So somebody who's had chronic trauma and done something in their head to help them escape it, it's pretty dead certain sure they're going to be diagnosed with a trauma disorder. Victims who suffer such interpersonal abuse prior to the age of 14 develop even more dissociative responses. Those whose trauma begins in the very early years, age 2, 3, 4, 5, can often develop what we refer to as dissociative identity disorder, used to be called multiple personalities. Trauma has its most pervasive impact when it occurs in a child or an adolescent, because again, they're malleable, and so they are now being shaped by evil with no protection. What happens when the mind leaves like that and dissociates is that the information and the experiences are not regulated. And so it's as if somebody had a bunch of file drawers in their head. And so this thing that happened when I was 3 in my bedroom goes in this file, and this thing that happened when I was 12 and at my uncle's farm goes in this file. And what you will find with people who have suffered from complex trauma or this disorder is they can't tell you a story of their lives. They can give you pieces like this, but they've never made a narrative out of it because in their mind they kept leaving what was happening. And of course, trauma, if we really look at it, defies our normal categories. I spent 4 hours yesterday at Auschwitz. It defies normal categories. I mean, you can say it was bad. You can say it was evil. I mean, even that doesn't say it. So here you have a child growing up with things that adults can't put into words. And they're supposed to manage it somehow and still grow up. There are no files in the brain of a child where their whole abusive experience can be remembered and understood. It's not possible. Think about it. You have a 5-year-old girl. She lives in a house where she's chronically neglected, which means she's not fed regularly. Sometimes she's put down in the cellar and a piece of bread is tossed down. Nobody touches her except to hit her. Nobody tucks her in at night. She has no toys. Nobody's ever read her a story. She is beaten